Last year, at least, Andre and I were part of a panel, and a few other people, about a conversation between Marxism and anarchism. And I'll sort of repeat what I said there for 1 second and then go into something different. Some of you might have been at that last year. I liked that it actually started a conversation here. But I actually contended last year, and I still contend this, that that's the wrong question between Marxism and anarchism. I actually still think the question is sort of between a libertarian and a non-libertarian left. And by left, I mean people who are opposed to capitalism and other forms of exploitation and hierarchy and actually want to see social revolution. I'm not talking about the left as social democratic or reformist. I actually want to reclaim the left as revolutionary. So that, to me, was how last year I spent a lot of time talking, is framing it around how do we understand the difference between libertarian and non-libertarian left, in order to say that I'm going to kind of ignore the non-libertarian left and actually speak to the fact that I want the conversation for me to happen is how do we understand a libertarian left, and how do we see that functioning at this historical moment. And I'd like to actually broaden out anarchism, Marxism, to be more generally, I think Marx is obviously the seminal person to understand on that. But I actually want to broaden Marxism to be communism and socialism more broadly, or communism. And I want to broaden anarchism to also include anti-authoritarianism and to understand both within the tradition of socialism. Does that make sense? So we're actually speaking about a libertarian socialism, as Andre started the panel out with, talking about what would a libertarian socialism look like for the 21st century. And I actually want to advocate that we don't actually get so bogged down in trying to define a term for the 21st century, but try to understand what a horizontalist or libertarian politics would look like, libertarian left again. I actually think at this historical moment that is sort of the lovely position now, the default position. So one argument I would like to make is actually that is what's happening right now, is everybody actually has to kind of start from the libertarian left that's a revolutionary or a radical and respond to that, which is a real big shift. Because 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, it was the authoritarian left that was the sort of pole that the libertarian left had to respond to, and I think that's actually been shifted around, which has freed up space for both anarchists, Marxists, socialists, anti-authoritarians, communists, who all understand themselves on the libertarian left. That's a good thing. Okay, and I want to agree with both what Roxanne and Andre talked about. Maybe we could all three talk about this. Would be my question we come back to is what would synthesis look like? And I don't know if any of us are going to get to that, but that would be a good question. If we're going to synthesize these things, what would we draw out that are the best of these traditions? And I actually like pulling from the best of liberalism, the radical edges of liberalism that are more libertarian, but that's because I came through my anarchism through Murray Bookchin, who did that, and I think did that really well, is drew out what are some of the radical potentialities in people like Thomas Paine, or I'm going to use the Western tradition, Rousseau and other people. But we could find those same libertarian strains in the non-Western tradition as well. Okay, so what would be the best of synthesis? Right now, I think there's an intriguing thing. I want to talk for a few minutes about what the bad syntheses are right now that are just intriguing syntheses. I shouldn't have used the word bad, because they may actually point towards something that we're not yet seeing, and they may actually be really productive for something that's hasn't quite yet been revealed. So it's a curious historical moment to me where there's actually new syntheses and blends going on. One of them within the anarchist world is what's sort of for shorthand being kind of called the Occupy Everything milieu within the student movement. Some people are labeling it social war or social insurrectionary movement. But I actually think it's kind of an interesting blend coming out of people being really intrigued by the writings of the coming insurrection and other ideas emanating out of Europe, which were really an interesting mix of anarchism and communism and the best of the libertarian traditions in a certain sense, or reworkings of it coming out of Europe and brought to the United States. So now I'm speaking specifically about the United States. And it's almost become a caricatured, and I'm going to stretch out the argument, but because I think this still offers us, at its worst, how it's trying to synthesize, because I think sometimes it does a better job of it. At its worst, I think it's taking the extreme position within anarchism of autonomy without any sense of the socialness of it, almost to the point of where it's almost not anarchism, it's bringing in the sort of nihilism, but it's really looking at the far side of, I don't even want to call it individualism anarchism. It really is a sense of the individual and all the individual right now can do is try to find a few other individuals, and those individuals will try to do things, but we're not even sure what they will do because we can't predict what will happen right now. We just have to do, which is a little disturbing to me, to do without content particularly, like where does that lead us? But on the other hand, it's led to a return to a look at capitalism again. So I actually think it's an interesting time, because in a sense it's pointing to a critique of the alienation in capitalism that makes us feel so autonomous. It's also taking from the worst of Marxism, in that people are actually going back to clandestine, vanguardist forms of organizing within the guise of anarchism. So that's my critique of the one contemporary strain of synthesis I think is really problematic within anarchism, where you're sort of taking the far poles of both sides of anarchism and Marxism and actually blending them into an autonomous authoritarianism, which I find disturbing in certain ways. Okay. The problems within Marxism right now that I think is a weird synthesis is sort of having to now pretend you're an anarchist as a Marxist. I've heard some ISO folks speak recently, and other people from pretty sectarian or authoritarian parts of the left, and they sound like anarchists, and I'm just like, and then someone will go, that's ISO, and I'm like, really? But then when you push them, or when they don't practice like an anarchist, and they're disingenuous about why they're using that language. They're not using it because they embody it, it's because it's a way to hopefully recruit other people, because they understand now they need to now use that pole in order to gain recruits. So that's a disturbing, again, synthesis for me, is where you hide where you're getting your anarchism from, or you hide that you're not even an anarchist. At its best, there's some Marxists that are using anarchism really well, but not admitting that it's anarchism. So another example that's maybe better is like Hart and Negre and a lot of people that come out of that, where they're pretending they don't like anarchists, but then they're actually borrowing from anarchism. And they're actually doing a nice synthesis, so just admit you're doing it. That's a problem in Marxism, I think, right now. Okay, which replicate some of the worst in Marxism, which is the disingenuousness about what the project is, a sort of hidden agenda, trying to kind of recruit as opposed to actually build a synthesis. Okay, so now on to the love, how much, no, I have like 7 minutes left. I was trying not to talk for 20 minutes. Okay, now, what I think actually would create a better synthesis, I don't know that I'll actually get at this in the next 5 minutes, but I'd like, if we actually have time to talk about this, what a synthesis will look like. I think this is actually the right historical moment for us to actually move toward a synthesis that maybe even begins to drop those words and some of the baggage from those things. And I actually think people in other parts of the world have been taking the lead a lot longer than we have at that, where they're actually like, the point is to take the best from these traditions and not even call it that anymore, and actually call it what makes sense in the local context, but are thoroughly anti-capitalist, thoroughly global in outlook, but are localist in the sense that we're borrowing traditions, whether those indigenous traditions or cultural forms, or forms that people get out of certain forms of ethnicity or identity, or even whatever, and bringing those with anarchism and Marxism, but not necessarily calling it that anymore. And so a lot of the social movements that we look to and are really inspired by, we don't necessarily say, oh, those are anarchists that are taking over land in that country, or those are anarchists that are setting up autonomous communities, or et cetera. But we understand, or those are Marxists doing that, reappropriating land. We say, wow, that's a really interesting, new, innovative way of doing something. But what would actually be interesting for us is to go back and actually uncover the better parts that they're drawing out, and actually maybe analyze that in order to use those lessons in the work we're doing, which would be nice to kind of pull it apart. So the best synthesis for me right now, and I think actually makes most sense, is sort of the 3 ways that seems to be happening. That was one way, I think, where we have movements that don't worry about whether they're using the language, but are actually trying to come up with something innovative, and maybe getting rid of the language is actually allowing for that innovation. So most of us in the last 15 years have been calling that horizontalism, or world from below, phrases like that. But that actually, I think, is thoroughly much more powerful than me saying I'm an anarchist, or a Marxist, because I'm actually an anarcho-communist. So it is, to me, what's powerful about that is it speaks to almost everybody, because right now people get that they want a world from below. They want power back over their lives. They want to shape the world themselves. And I think those movements have actually been leading the way at speaking a language that resonates with people and actually getting out radical ideas